Hi there, my name is Alex, and I'm here today with Resonance to talk to you about compressors. This is a 3-part series covering everything you need to know about compressors. In this first video, we're going to cover the fundamentals of how to use a compressor when it relates to audio production. So let's get started. What does a compressor do? Well, in short, it is used to shape the dynamics of the audio passed through it. Typically, a compressor is used to raise the average amplitude of a signal by bringing quieter elements of the sound to the foreground, as well as reducing the amplitude of louder peaks in the audio, often referred to as decreasing the dynamic range of the signal. Dynamic range is the range of amplitude between the quietest part and the loudest part of the audio. This will vary between recordings and mixes, and sometimes a large dynamic range is desired, like a whisper followed by an explosion in a film soundtrack. It would be unrealistic and not very exciting if the whisper was louder than the explosion. However, there are times where a larger dynamic range is not desirable. Some examples include vocal recordings, where the singer moves close to and then further from the microphone, changing the volume of the signal, often the case with live music. This will mean constantly riding the fader up and down to compensate, or to use lots of automation in your DAW, both of which are time-consuming and largely impractical.
Ooh, baby, I'ma love you differently. I'll give you electricity, give it to you. Ooh, baby, I'ma love you differently. I'll give you electricity, give it to you.
Another example is with ghost notes on a snare drum. Compared to the big hits, the difference in amplitude between these signals is huge, and often the snare will be set in the mix according to its peak volume, often leaving the ghost notes too quiet and inaudible. For both of these examples, a compressor could solve the problem. In order to use a compressor effectively, we need to understand what the common parameters are and how to control them. Firstly, we have threshold. This is the amplitude at which the compressor starts to work. If you set the threshold to -10 decibels, then any signal below this will remain untouched and pass through the compressor unchanged. Any signal above -10 dB, however, will be subject to compression and pass through the compressor changed. Lowering the threshold further will cause the compression to be applied to more of the signal. The amount of compression applied to the audio above the threshold is determined by the ratio control. The ratio control determines the amount of compression delivered to the audio above the set threshold. Commonly, the ratio will be listed as 1:1, 2:1, 4:1 and beyond. If we set the compressor to a 2:1 ratio, it will mean that for every 2 decibels of signal above the threshold, only 1 decibel of signal will come out. An 8:1 ratio will mean that for every 8 decibels of signal above the threshold, only 1 decibel will come out, so a bigger reduction. Likewise, a 1:1 ratio will do nothing, as for every 1 decibel above the threshold, the compressor will reduce it to 1, so it remains exactly the same. The next important control is the output or makeup gain. When applying any amount of compression, the overall output signal will be quieter. All compressors will have an output or makeup gain control to allow the user to turn up the signal and make up for the loss in volume. It is good practice to try and match the perceived output volume of the compressor to the original input volume, so that you can bypass the compressor and hear exactly what effect it has had on your audio, rather than it just sounding louder and assuming what you've done must have been good. Next is the attack control. The attack control, which is usually described in milliseconds, controls how long the compressor will take to react to a signal above the threshold. There are many useful applications for this. For example, if a drum hit peaks above the threshold, and the attack time is set slow, such as over 100 milliseconds, it is likely that the compressor will only begin to work after part of the initial transient has passed through. This could mean that the stick sound will pass through unaffected, but the rest of the snare hit and tail will be compressed. This may be desirable as it retains some of the attack, whilst still adding some compression. If you need the compressor to start working as soon as the sound goes above the threshold, make sure to set a fast attack time. Another common control is release. It tells the compressor how long to wait before reducing compression after the signal has gone back below the threshold. This is also set in milliseconds, and in combination with the attack value can help smooth the audible distortion that the compressor can introduce. It is worth noting that setting the release too high can mean the compressor remains active continuously. The release control is often paired with an auto-release option, which will dynamically adjust the release time set by the user, making it faster or slower based on the input signal. This is not a one-button fixes all, so make sure to learn how to use release first. The knee control, found on some compressors, will help to soften the compression of transients, similar to the attack and release control, but this time it is relating to the ratio. Setting a hard knee means that as soon as the audio signal hits the threshold, the compression will kick in at the ratio you've set. Setting a soft knee means that the compressor will slowly start adding compression to the signal as it approaches the threshold level, and it does it at a lower ratio, gradually increasing as the signal gets closer to the threshold level. This easing in and out of the ratio amount will help to soften the effect of the compressor activating. The final thing to discuss in this video is where to use a compressor in the signal chain. Now, historically, the limitations of outboard hardware would dictate, to a certain extent, how we would use a compressor. The mixing desk would have 1 or 2 insert points per channel at the start of the signal chain, usually before the EQs and auxiliary sends. This would ordinarily be where the compressor would sit. We could, of course, bus out to a compressor via an auxiliary. This would give us the option to run it side by side in parallel with the uncompressed audio, or to use it as another insert send. But things are starting to get messy with having to balance the returning audio sends and the amount of equipment. But what if we wanted to have the EQ beforehand, or add a reverb and then compress? We could just buy more and more outboard gear, daisy chain them together and return it to the desk, but now things have become very expensive. These logistical problems had kept creativity under certain restrictions. However, these days, we have powerful computers with digital audio workstations that have seemingly limitless flexibility. This means that the traditional placement of the compressor at the start of the signal chain is no longer the only option. You can basically do whatever you like. Experiment using compression in any and all points in the signal chain. Use multiple compressors, use them on auxiliaries, overuse them, use more than one. Just get used to using them. If it sounds good to you, then it is. That's it for this video. Join us next time. We'll be talking about the differences in compressor types and circuits.
Google Resonance Education or check us out on social media. One Institute, endless opportunities. Join the pioneers.